chapter 29, From Camelot to Watergate. So Camelot refers to JFK's presidency. A couple of weeks before he was inaugurated, a musical, Camelot, came out talking about King Arthur leading his young knights in all kinds of good challenges, and it was suggestive of the Kennedy White House. This is who he appeared to be, or who he wanted to appear to be, a guy leading young men into victory. Watergate, of course, refers to Nixon, and so in this chapter we're looking at the presidencies of Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Kennedy in Camelot. So JFK made a show of presenting himself to the public as young, vigorous, athletic, and intellectual. And he went through great pains to keep that image alive. He was inviting intellectuals to the White House, running a physical fitness campaign. He said that the youth were becoming flabby because of so much television. But this image was a little bit misleading. Kennedy was not really an intellectual. He was quick-witted, he was intelligent, but not truly an intellectual. And on top of that, he had all sorts of health problems for which he took painkillers and amphetamines to deal with. Not to mention, he engaged in a reckless series of extramarital sexual adventures. So, regardless of that, members of his administration did pride themselves on being the best and the brightest. Many of the people in Kennedy's administration were young men with college degrees. And like the president himself, his administration pretty much failed to live up to the image that it created for itself. So one of the things that Kennedy faced first were the Cuban crises. There are two crises here. Kennedy believed that his main task as president of the United States was to stop the spread of communism. And so he sort of departed from Eisenhower because Eisenhower relied on America's nuclear arsenal. Kennedy, however, wanted to challenge communist aggression head on wherever it occurred. So the first incident took place in April of 1961, and this has been called the Bay of Pigs. That's an O. The Bay of Pigs incident. So we already talked about the fact that the regime in Cuba, led by Fulgencio Batista, had been overthrown by communist dictator Fidel Castro. So not long after taking power, Kennedy authorized an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles. So these are people who have been kicked out of Cuba, and the exiles believed that once they landed in Cuba, Cubans would flock to their side and they would shift from communism to democracy. So the CIA was training the exiles in Nicaragua. So once the training was complete, they landed at the Bay of Pigs, which is on the southern Cuban coast, and it was a complete fiasco. It exposed the United States to all the criticism that a straightforward assault would have, and it also failed to overthrow Castro. The reason this failed was that the B-26s that arrived for backup arrived an hour late, and so they were most likely confused by the time change in the zones between Nicaragua and Cuba, but they were shot down by Cubans, and the invasion was pretty much crushed later that day. So Kennedy faced a lot of criticism because of that, and as a result, again, Fidel Castro was not defeated, he was not executed, and he moved toward the Soviet path, toward communist, well, he was already communist, but USSR leanings. So in June of 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the leader of Russia at the time, or the USSR, met in Vienna, and Khrushchev blustered about taking West Berlin because JFK had attempted to overthrow the communist regime in Cuba. And so in August, just a couple of months later, Khrushchev ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall. And this was basically a concrete and barbed wire wall that would stop East Germans from going into non-communist zones. In the United States and the USSR, both sides resumed nuclear testing. They built up massive nuclear arsenals. Kennedy instructed the CIA to initiate massive activity against Castro's regime, which included attempts to assassinate the dictator. So in October of 1962, Khrushchev placed Soviet troops, bombers, and nuclear missiles in Cuba. And this is the second thing that occurred. And this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, Khrushchev placed Soviet troops, bombers, and missiles in Cuba. And so Kennedy pretty much forced a showdown by ordering the U.S. Navy to halt the shipment of offensive weapons to Cuba. And so they stopped every vessel headed toward Cuba and turned back ones that contained offensive weapons. JFK told Khrushchev to remove the weapons from Cuba, or there would be, quote, a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union, end quote. And so at this point, the world just sort of held its breath for several days until Khrushchev finally backed down. And some Kennedy supporters said this was his finest hour. Other people said in retrospect that it looks like he overreacted here. But both Kennedy and Khrushchev seem to have been sobered by the possibility of a missile showdown. The humiliation, though, that Khrushchev faced as he was forced to back down to Kennedy contributed to his overthrow a couple years later by hardliners in the Soviet Union. So the Vietnam War. We've already talked about the fact that the French were defeated in Indochina in 1954, and the parties agreed after that to general elections in 1956. And so basically you had these two sides in Vietnam. You've got Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, and Diem, which I can't pronounce the first part of his name, but you've got Ho Chi Minh and Diem, the American-backed leader of South Vietnam. And Diem canceled the election, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would defeat him, and with American assistance just attempted to build a new nation in South Vietnam. So the Viet Minh units that remained in the South, later called the Viet Cong, this is like the communist military, formed these secret cells and waited. And so by the late 50s, they had gained considerable strength and had become even more militant. And by May of 1959, the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters began an insurgency that gave them control of large sections of the countryside in Vietnam. And as a senator, Kennedy had backed Diem, and after his failure at the Bay of Pigs, he really wanted to improve his reputation. And so he began to expand the American commitment to Vietnam in the fight against communism. So by 1963, there were over 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, and at this point, 120 American soldiers had been killed. And in spite of that commitment, the regime that was led by Diem was faltering by 1963. And one of the reasons Diem was failing was that he was a devoted Catholic, but he began to crack down really heavily on Buddhists. And Kennedy tried really hard to get him to moderate his policies, and Diem would not do it. So Kennedy sent word to the Vietnamese generals who were already unhappy with Diem that he would support them if they ousted Diem. So his generals took power on November 1st, and they killed Diem. Some people argue that Kennedy would have never continued with the Vietnam War, but the evidence actually indicates otherwise. The Civil Rights Movement. So Kennedy was really cautious about how he approached the Civil Rights Movement, and that was because he was elected partly by African Americans and partly by white Southerners. So he had to approach that very carefully. And again, he had a narrow victory, so he really wanted to keep this voting base. So in February of 1960, 4 black students staged a sit-in at Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this was an act of peaceful protest, an act of defiance that inspired similar actions all across the South. Another common form of protest that blacks and whites alike engaged in were the Freedom Rides of 1961. And again, integrated groups of people, so blacks and whites, riding around in protest. And this actually did turn violent in a couple of instances. In Alabama, there was a Greyhound bus that a group of whites actually came up to it. They slashed the tires, chased the bus, threw a firebomb in the back, and beat the people as they came out. But for the most part, the Freedom Rides were a peaceful form of protest. This type of demonstration eventually broke down legal and racial barriers in the South. And some prominent African Americans emerged during this time. Some of them were impatient with the peaceful protesting, and they wanted a more militant form of defiance. So black nationalism became a really strong force. One of the leaders of the black Muslims, Elijah Muhammad, called for the establishment of separate black and white nations. He actually wasn't violent, but he was more, I guess, militant than some of his counterparts about the establishment of two separate nations. Martin Luther King, also a nonviolent, peaceful protester. In 1963, he staged massive demonstrations in Birmingham, and during which he was arrested. And while in jail, he wrote letters from a Birmingham jail, which have become really popular. But this type of demonstration eventually pushed Kennedy to change his policy and to stop being so cautious with the civil rights movement. And so he lent his support to a modest civil rights bill. And so it went to Congress, it stalled. Civil rights groups, meanwhile, were organizing a massive demonstration in Washington, and then Kennedy was assassinated. His assassination took place in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. The police apprehended Lee Harvey Oswald, and there was lots of evidence that linked him to the assassination. Mainly, he had fired a rifle from a nearby warehouse. But before he could be brought to trial, he was actually murdered by someone else. But the investigation, which was headed by Chief Justice Warren, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. It was not part of some major conspiracy or anything like that. And there wasn't much evidence to suggest that Oswald was a part of a larger conspiracy. But many people then and still do doubt the Warren Commission's conclusion. So upon Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes the president. And before he was vice president, from 1949 until he was vice president, Johnson was a senator. And for most of that time, he was the Senate Democratic leader. He was known as a master of manipulation. He could use the heavy-handed tactics and the subtle approaches to gain his objectives. And really his inspiration was Franklin Roosevelt, because of Roosevelt's commitment to social welfare reform and social welfare legislation. And in that, he did differ markedly from President Kennedy. One of Kennedy's most famous quotes, or maybe his most famous quote, is "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And that's not how it went with Johnson. Kennedy, for example, when Congress blocked his very modest domestic agenda, which was better education, urban renewal, higher minimum wage, Kennedy didn't really react violently. He was very mild about the situation. It didn't really seem to rattle him too much. But Johnson was very forthright, and he wanted to use his power to make changes, and he was very clear about that. As soon as he assumed office after Kennedy's death, Johnson exploited the atmosphere surrounding Kennedy's assassination to push forward an expanded version of Kennedy's civil rights bill through Congress. And so he pushed through the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And again, this was an expanded version of Kennedy's bill, and he even boasted, civil riders are going to have to wear sneakers to keep up with me. But he just aspired to be a great reformer like FDR, and he declared war on poverty in America and set out to create a great society, or the great society, where poverty would no longer exist. And he just went on to put forth a lot of measures, laws, corporations, things like that that would help people, I guess, escape poverty. One of them was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and this created the Job Corps, and the Job Corps provided education for small children. It established work-study programs for college students and that kind of thing. And so the election of 1964 then happens. So Kennedy was assassinated in 63. Johnson had like a year or so to serve as president before another election came up. And in the next election, he had a sweeping victory over the hardcore conservative Barry Goldwater. And after his victory, he pressed for further reforms. And under his leadership, Congress passed the Medicare Act in 1965. Medicare gave people over 65 hospital insurance, and poor people younger than 65 health care, which was called Medicaid. Congress also passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also 1965. It gave more funding to schools for programs like Head Start. And Head Start is like a pre-K for impoverished families. I think you not only have to be impoverished, but maybe you also have to be behind, like developmentally behind. But it also provided medical exams and nutritious meals to those children. And then the third was the Voting Rights Act, also 1965. This was federal intervention to protect black registration and voting in 6 of the southern states. And so that was just a few of the things that Johnson had passed. Other programs provided support for the arts, for scientific research, highway safety, crime control, the clearance of slums, clean air and water, the preservation of historic sites. And so the scope and intent of the Great Society programs were truly remarkable, but in practice, they didn't always have the impact that President Johnson had desired. Okay, so we'll pick up in the next video with new racial turmoil and the beat movement and student radicalism.